Good afternoon and welcome to our panel on Afghanistan. I am Shah Zakram, Executive Director of the Women's Foreign Policy Group, a network of international affairs professionals dedicated to advancing women's leadership, amplifying their voices through substantive global issues like today's discussion, and preparing the next generation and mid-career professionals for leadership through year-round mentoring and professional development. I'm delighted to welcome our panelists, Rina Amiri, Ambassador Melanne Verveer, and Gayle Lemmon. I also welcome Dr. Alyssa Ayres, who will be moderating today's timely conversation on Afghanistan and the impact of US withdrawal on the future of women in education. We want to include your questions as well. You can send them in through the Q&A option button at the bottom of your screen at any point during the conversation, and we will include as many as we can. At this time, I would like to introduce Dr. Alyssa Ayres. She's the new Dean of the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. She also serves on WFPG's Board of Directors. Dr. Ayres, I turn the panel over to you.
Thank you, Shaz, and good afternoon, everyone. As you just heard, my name is Alyssa Ayres. I think this is, we can all agree, this is a very sobering time for Afghanistan and for US foreign policy, and as well for the vital question of women in foreign policy. So to talk about this intersection of issues today, we have no better panel of experts to help us understand the stakes. I am delighted, of course, to be able to discuss with such a panel of incredible women today, but I think we probably all wish it were under less catastrophic circumstances. Each of our panelists today has a unique vantage point on the crisis for women in Afghanistan. So let me briefly introduce all three. Their longer bios are with you in the announcement of today's program, so you'll have that to consult. First, Rina Amiri, an Afghan-American scholar and policy practitioner. She's currently an independent policy and mediation advisor, a senior fellow at NYU's Center for International Cooperation at NYU's Center for Global Affairs. Rina brings over 2 decades of political expertise advising and working with governments, the United Nations, and think tanks in conflict settings. During the Obama administration, she served as senior advisor to the US Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, and prior to that also served as a member of the UN Special Representative of the Secretary General's political team in Afghanistan during the course of the implementation of the Bonn Agreement. Next, we have Ambassador Melanne Verveer. She is the executive director of the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. She previously served as the first ever U.S. ambassador for global women's issues. She's also served as the U.S. representative to the UN Commission on the Status of Women, the chair and co-CEO of Vital Voices Global Partnership, and as assistant to the president and chief of staff to the First Lady during the Clinton administration. She led the effort to establish the President's Interagency Council on Women and was instrumental in the adoption of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. Third, we have Gayle Lemmon, who is the author of the New York Times best-selling books, The Dressmaker of Khair Khana, which is about Afghanistan, Ashley's War, the untold story of a team of women soldiers on the Special Ops battlefield, also about Afghanistan, and her newest, The Daughters of Kobani, which was just published. Ms. Lemmon, who serves as an adjunct senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, previously covered politics at the ABC News political unit and led public policy analysis during the global financial crisis at the global investment firm PIMCO. So why don't we begin? Rina, I think we'll ask you to just help us contextualize what we have seen in the last 2 weeks against the hopes that so many Afghan citizens have had for their country. You're a trained mediator. From the perspective of a peace builder and a mediator, what do you see as the outlook for the year ahead in Afghanistan for human rights, for women, and what can be done to help?
Thank you very much for having me as a part of this really important discussion. You know, I've been speaking to women as well as other members of the rights-based community for the last several weeks. First, I was doing a research project looking at inclusive ceasefires. And so I literally was speaking to people in every part of the country. And as the Taliban advanced, I was on the phone with these women as their districts fell, as their provinces fell. And just you could literally see that within a day, within hours, their life just being completely transformed. They went from having some element of hope. They genuinely had wanted to believe that when the Taliban came in, that they would have learned lessons, that this was a different Afghanistan, that they would be rehabilitated. Some of them had actually gone and met with them in Doha and in Norway and private discussions. But over and over again, what I heard was something very systematic, that the Taliban would take over. They would have a list of organizations, women's organizations, journalists' organizations, the rights-based community, and they would go and they would knock on their door and they would say, we know who you are, we know what you've been doing. And they would just very systematically shake them down, go to their offices, go through their material. They didn't actually have to lift a finger to create this enormous climate of fear and intimidation. And Afghanistan right now is a country that's going through post-traumatic stress disorder. This is not only because of the very devastating things that are happening right now, but also because they've been through this, or their parents have been through this 20 years ago. And so there is this enormous level of frustration and fear that they have been abandoned to this, that in many ways they feel that the international community enabled this. And they've gone overnight, literally, from having lives that I would argue were not so different from ours, that they would be on social media. They were sitting down with their families watching television. They were planning for their futures. And these, particularly the women right now, they've been told to stay home. They've been told that they can go to work once their facilities become desegregated. The women in government have been told that even if there is going to be any type of inclusion, that they're certainly not going to be in senior positions. And so their lives have literally changed overnight. And this is such a stark difference from the commitments that had been made 20 years ago, the championing of women's rights. But that part wasn't such a dramatic shift in my perspective. And it wasn't unnoticed by the women themselves that in the last 2 years in particular, as the US and the international community sought to extricate itself from Afghanistan, they shifted the narrative from women's rights are a priority to, well, this is an internal affair that should just be negotiated among Afghans. And this was put in place in a way that by the time that, where they started working on the peace agreement, not only were there certainly no members of the Islamic Republic sitting at the table, there were no women represented in any way. And while they argued that they had consultations with women, they weren't included in any meaningful way. They weren't referenced in any meaningful way, except to say that it's going to be discussed in internal Afghan discussions. And so this enabled the Taliban. This certainly created an environment where they became much more emboldened, much more strident. And so now we are in the situation where the Taliban have taken militarily over the country. They are, again, they're masters of strategic communication. So now they're saying, okay, we're the rehabilitated Taliban. We're going to give women their rights within the confines of Islam, which a caveat, which I want to get into later. But so the question is, to what extent, as the international community scrambles to figure out how they're going to engage the Taliban, while they're very concerned about, there are very legitimate concerns. We're facing multiple concerns. We're facing security concerns with not just ISIS, other terrorist groups. We're facing one of the most devastating humanitarian situations where over 14 million members of the Afghan population are going to face starvation. We're facing a human rights crisis where people, the rights-based community feels under siege. And so and I think that what I'm seeing and hearing within the policy and community is a desire to quickly figure out how to consolidate the Taliban to address all of these challenges. And once again, what makes me very, very concerned is that the checks that the international community has committed to putting in place before giving up more leverage to the Taliban might be put to the side. For example, there are sources of leverage, even though it's much more limited. There's recognition, there is sanctioning, there's aid, there's the political, the diplomatic platform that's there, and in the desire to quickly work with a force to prevent further instability, that they might be giving all of that away. And the Taliban actually know this and are going to use it to their strategic advantage. So what I would say that as we move forward, what the international community, the US and the international community has to do is really deliberate in terms of what are our assets and how strategically can we use it? How can we work with the region? Because now things have flipped. It's not going to be the US and Europe that are going to be in the lead. It's going to be the region. But how do we work with the region to speak in one voice? Because that is the only way that we're actually going to be able to collectively bring our leverage together and to empower the forces in the country that will address all of the concerns that ultimately need to be addressed. To create a more modern Afghanistan, you need women. We know the data, we know the studies, and this is the moderating force. To address the economic plight, to address the humanitarian issue, they're both victims, but they're also agents in all of this. And they have to be empowered, and they have to be seen as strategic allies and assets rather than as victims and collateral damage of a war gone too long. Thank you.
Thank you, Rina. That is quite a bleak outlook, but you've got some great suggestions for approaching the political side of things. Can I ask Ambassador Verveer now, how does this look to you? What does this mean for the women, peace, and security agenda? Afghanistan has been a signature case for what international cooperation can accomplish in support of women. It doesn't look great right now. I know you've also been very involved in the humanitarian side of things. So if you can speak a little bit about that too, it would be great to hear.
Well, thank you, Alyssa, and it's good to be with you and to all of the friends of the Women's Foreign Policy Group. To build a little bit on what Rina said, under the framework of women, peace, and security, it is, as you said, Alyssa, a real test for this framework that was developed by the United Nations a couple decades ago, recognizing that women have a critical role to play, both in participation, in recovery, but also to be protected, recognizing the disparate impacts of these conflicts. And to that point, the United States has obligations because we now have a law for women, peace, and security, not just a national action plan, but the first ever law. And how is that going to be implemented in ways that impact the current situation? I would say first, the most important thing is the security issue, particularly for those high risk Afghan women who have stood by the United States, who have implemented our programs, who have advanced our interests and our values, and at great risk to themselves. Some of the most prominent are in the bullseye of the Taliban right now. Rina described some of the ways that they are being intimidated. And there is a campaign of terror and intimidation, and they are feeling it keenly. And none of them wanted to be a refugee again, but that is where the die has been cast. And so we owe it to them. Many have been evacuated in the last couple weeks, but there's a long list of many more who remain at great risk. And everything needs to be done to ensure that the remaining Americans, as well as certainly the Afghans who deserve to be evacuated, are able to be evacuated. How that is going to happen now remains to be seen. The airport, as we all know, is closed. It needs a lot of rehabilitation, I understand. It appears as though the Qataris will play a management role. What is their role? Are the Turks going to have a role? We don't know about commercial flights coming up or charter flights that will be allowed. So all of that is to be determined in terms of air lifts, but also the exploration of overland evacuation as well. So it's a time when every effort is being made and there needs to be support from all elements involved in this to ensure that the evacuation of these extraordinarily deserving people who are greatly at risk occurs. Secondly, we have obligations now in terms of their resettlement. And it appears as though that many of the high-risk women leaders are going to come into the United States, be admitted on what is known as the humanitarian parole. And that will be their immigration status. It has benefits in that it can happen quickly, but it also is not the most ideal way for their refugee status to be determined because very few benefits or services are attached to the humanitarian parole, unlike the refugee programs like the P2 program or the special immigrant visas that were issued. So this is going to be a critical need for these women, having financial guarantors, having sponsors, raising funds so that they can actually provide for themselves and their families and live at this time. The State Department announced yesterday a funding opportunity for Afghan parolees, but it is very meager compared to what the need is going to be. I think we need to see action from Congress on addressing this humanitarian parole benefits issue so that the women and their families can live in dignity until their immigration status is finalized. They've given their lives working on behalf of the interests of the United States and on behalf of everything we value. And I think at this moment, it's the least we can do for them. So the second point is what we need to do in terms of their resettlement. Thirdly, there have been appropriations that have passed in terms of the emergency situation of the Afghans. A significant portion of those resources needs to be directed to these high-risk women. They've come with very little. They have to find employment ultimately in a foreign country. They are needing to survive, and we need to do everything we can to ensure that they have the lifeline to be able to do that. So we have to look at what's been appropriated and how that can be distributed in a way that is beneficial. I want to move also now from this immediate to visible crisis that we're all reading about, hearing about, watching, acting on, to the invisible crisis. And that's the humanitarian catastrophe that is unfolding in Afghanistan. The lack of food, the lack of basic necessities that people need. Women, again, are disparately impacted. They will have critical needs. There are growing numbers of IDPs, mostly women and children, that will have to be addressed. So the question for the international community and our own country is going to be, how is this humanitarian assistance going to be provided? Will it be conditioned? How will conditions, if they're applied, not harm the people who most need the assistance? How will it not be used as a benefit for the Taliban, as a reward for the Taliban, and ensure that it's not deflected? So there is this critical humanitarian need, and I know many US organizations that operate in this field are asking for the OFAC licensing so that they can provide the assistance at this critical time. Another issue is the human rights issue that, again, Rina mentioned. the great majority of women are going to be living in a Taliban-controlled country now. That is a fact. And how will we know, given the history? Is past going to be prologue? All the signs would suggest it thus far, that women are going to have their human rights abused. And how is this going to be investigated? Is there going to be a robust monitoring mechanism that's set up? Is it going to be set up through the United Nations Human Rights Council? How is this going to go forward? Because we know that despite this exceptionally strong rhetoric about the Taliban will bring you no harm, this is a new Taliban, that the reality is what they've already shown is opposite that statement, but also because of this commitment to establishing an Islamic Emirates that is so radical in its application in terms of what it represents for women, not being able to leave the home, girls not being able to be educated, all of the things we saw in the late 90s. So this human rights monitoring mechanism needs to be something that we and others try to determine how to go forward. And then there's the issue of recognition for the Taliban. And is the United States going to be moved in that direction? There's nothing that the Taliban would like more besides money, which I guess is the other lever. But as Rina again stated, the jihadists are going to find or expect sanctuary now. We saw ISIS-K loom its head, Al-Qaeda is still there. What is the United States going to do in these circumstances? Are we going to make some kind of a deal with the Taliban? So this whole issue of how this relationship might be advanced, if it's advanced with a ruthless force, and what that represents for women, should it come to pass. Will a deal be made and women and human rights violations just be something that we close our eyes to? So that's another issue that has to be addressed. And then finally, I would say, so many of the women who have been evacuated, who, God help us, will be evacuated, are women of extraordinary capacity. They are leaders. They have moved the human rights, women's rights agenda in Afghanistan and so much more. What will their role be now in the United States or in Europe in human rights, in terms of advancing their think tanks, in terms of the networking they've done? What role would they play in exile with the great numbers of women remaining in Afghanistan? And I think that's something we need to think through that also requires our support. And I will end there, and I know there's a lot more to say.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Verveer. Gayle, you have chronicled women's lives, women's creativity, women's entrepreneurship in Afghanistan, even under some of the worst circumstances. I know you're still in touch with many women in Afghanistan that you know well. Can you bring some of these stories to life? Tell us what you are hearing, what the circumstances are. What do you expect to see that might be unexpected?
So I guess I'll start by saying thank you. It's a real pleasure and a privilege to be here. There's so much to discuss, and I'll just keep it pretty tight and say it has been a very difficult set of weeks, not for us, we're sitting here. It's been incredibly difficult for people who are navigating their world moving 180 degrees in the opposite direction. And I just want to push, because I know, so many of you here today, maybe you sort of follow this, but not, and then hour by hour way that others do. And I would just say this, the one thing we must guard against is the otherization, because these are young women, just like the women in your family, your neighbors, your daughters, your nieces, your cousins, who went from the Islamic Republic, she's Islamic Emirate, who are watching their world go from worrying about university studies, around universities, 51% female, worrying about university studies to worrying about forced marriage in a matter of weeks. And it's not that people didn't see it coming. It's that the speed has surprised people and the ferocity of the impact of the velocity, I would say, actually, right, that has taken people aback. So you see people do almost anything. Young women who are just incredibly brave risk almost every danger to flee to something because they don't know what the next day will be like. And in a country where 2/3 of the country is under 25, right? So they don't remember the Taliban the last time around. And this is now a country that is more connected, more educated, more urban by every indicator, and is grappling, real people, just like the ones in your family, grappling with, what does that mean for my life? And to me, the reality is that the female superpower is just getting on with it. They will get on with it no matter what. You know, the book I had the privilege of writing was about young women who started businesses under the Taliban, who started schools under the Taliban. One young woman who taught Microsoft Office at a hospital under the Taliban. Young women who were the only breadwinners in their families under the Taliban because they worked for international NGOs. So all of this is going to happen because that is what women do. The question is, from the macro picture, are we as an international community, whatever remains of it post-Syria and Afghanistan, right? They have absolutely challenged the entire notion of an international community. Are we going to stand by people who are fighting every single day for their future? Whether they exist is not the question. They will absolutely keep fighting. It's whether we get the benefit of tapping into their ingenuity, creativity, and strength and courage as they press forward that remains, I think, to be seen. We are about to watch as the international community wrestles in very real time with what Taliban takeover means. 1996, if you go to Kabul University, there are amazing young people who work at the research center at ACKU who will show you the primary documents from the Taliban last time, right? You can look at the first notes from their meetings with NGOs where they say, you know, women cannot wear heels, they don't like the sound, no laughing outdoors, you must have a mahram or chaperone anytime you go out of the house, you must stay home because girls, you know, education of girls is not to be permitted. That was on paper. But what they wanted was the UN seat. They wanted the seat in New York first and foremost. There is leverage. And the Taliban was never a monolith. There was an amazing American, Nancy Dupree, who was in Afghanistan for 6 decades, who helped work on this. And she would always tell stories about, you know, the people she talked to. And I spent months of my life with the privilege of interviewing all these Afghan young women who worked during the Taliban time, and the international NGO folks who navigated that space, who worked the entire time. And a foreign woman would sit behind a wall, and the Taliban guy would be on the other side because they didn't want to see her, but they would negotiate access throughout, and that went out throughout. So I think the narrative that this never happened last time, or the narrative that women were kind of shuttered indoors and never left their house from 1996 to 2001 is also inaccurate. So how do we stand with those who fight for their communities while also thinking through the implications of international engagement with Taliban 2.0? And I think that is the question before us, because it is not an option for women to not be visible. It must not be, and it must not be something that the international community says is fine as long as stability reigns, because stability will not reign if half the population is not engaged. So if we're thinking about a national security question about how we think about the role of women and girls going forward, we must see these folks who are doing their own battle every day as allies and figure out creative ways that the United States of America, which is the United States of America, right? There are multiple paths to exercising leverage, right? Can be there to create options for both stability and opportunity.
Thank you, Gayle. Let me actually pick up the thread that you just left us on and ask Rina to comment on what next steps are available in the international community to try to halt or not allow a full oppression of women to take place.
I think just building on Gayle's point in terms of some of the points of leverage and what the Taliban are very keen to avoid, you know, the international community, the US feels itself in the middle of a dilemma where certainly this group is seen, at least by the American public, as quite odious, despite the fact that there's been a lot of work done to rehabilitate their image. They themselves are not helping themselves very much. But at the same time, needing to work with this group to address a host of issues that we've discussed. I mean, they do rule the country now. And it shouldn't be a question of recognition. Recognition should just be off the table. You can't stabilize without recognizing. And I think that that's a first point that really has to be very clear, both for the US and the international community. The region is already moving forward. China has made it very clear that they're going to be recognizing, but that should not start sort of a stampede towards recognition as the Taliban holds the ISIS gun to its head. So I think that that's a really important element. The second is really mobilizing, activating the UN to bring together the region together, to get the P5 countries, the Security Council, to engage the region and to get them to speak in one voice. Right now, most of these regional actors are engaging in bilateral negotiations with the Taliban. And when they do that, they're giving a lot away. And what we have to do is work together and bring, as Gayle said, this withering international community to actually bring it together, because that's our only chance of actually maintaining some sort of leverage with the Taliban. And third, we have to actually remedy what the damage that we've done in the last couple of years. I mean, I'm not even getting to the damage of the last couple of weeks. I'm talking about the fact that we have walked back our principles. We have walked back what we said that our commitment was to sort of a rights-based agenda, and it has not gone unnoticed. It has emboldened the Taliban. So they have become accustomed for the last 2 years that we will say things, but then we will not there's not going to be an accountability. So we can say, we have engaged in rhetoric. They have engaged in rhetoric. They have flouted and violated agreement after agreement, and there has been no consequences. So I think the other question to ask is, if they do not form an inclusive government, if they keep women out from, with all of these caveats that they have, that, you know, it's going to be in accordance of Islam and it has to be separate facilities, and, you know, all the things that they said in the 1990s, they're sort of bringing out their guidebook for how to deprive women of rights without really being explicit about it. And I think we need to have benchmarks, and again, really work with our partners in order to prevent that. We have to be much more strategic. And finally, the US has to stop thinking that it can just dispose of Afghanistan and walk away and then go and focus on East Asia, etc. We are an interconnected world. The problems in Afghanistan are not going to go away, and it's never, when it implodes, it bleeds into the region, it bleeds into Europe, and it ends up on US shores. And so for that reason, there has to be a more durable and more strategic approach that is not about a quick fix of a relationship with the Taliban, but actually looking more broadly as to how to support the allies that will actually engender a more stable form of governance that would prevent terrorism and further instability on both on the humanitarian front and certainly on more broadly in terms of stabilizing Afghanistan.
Thank you. I also want to pick up on something that Ambassador Verveer said, and Gayle touched on this as well. We have laws now in the United States to prioritize women in foreign policy and peace and security. How has that helped keep women on the foreign policy agenda in this crisis, if it has? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think We would all like to see it be a greater priority. I think there are some who believe it's not been a priority in terms of what we've all been going through over the last many months, even over the last 2 years when the previous administration entered into the deal with the Taliban that was never conditioned and in which they were not held accountable. But saying that, I also want to say that there have been many people in government with whom we have been working extremely closely over the last several weeks. First, on putting the list together of the most prominent at-risk women so that actions can begin to take place on that list long before the march into Kabul that made what we saw coming the reality that everybody saw. And people at the White House Gender Council, the work they've attempted to do internally, the office in the State Department on global women's issues, working with their colleagues, they have been at the table day and night because this has been a 24/7 proposition. So there have been very key elements within the administration, within the government, who have acted on the priority that this needs to be under the commitments that our own government has made to women, peace, and security. But as too often is the case, and has certainly been something that I've experienced over the years, it's not always what it needs to be. When you have top officials who will validate the importance of this and put a lot into action, you can make more happen. But the reality is that while it's been less than perfect, less than optimal, less than what it should be as a priority, there has been a lot of hard work going on. And I think we owe the people who've been at the table doing that work in government the thanks that they deserve for the work that they're doing. So it's not what it should be in every instance, but I don't want to say that it's been completely a lack of attention.
Thank you. Gayle, can I ask you to tackle that question as well? Because I know you've thought a lot about this too. How do we keep women on the national security agenda for all of the reasons that all three of you have outlined?
I think it's up to all of us. You know, there is no it's a we question. And I think there is a will there. I think there is an interest there. I think there is a desire there. But this is a dialogue that's evolving. I think Ambassador Verveer, Rina have been at the forefront of pushing for our national security to reflect the realities on the ground and the world that we live in 2021. And there are lots of people who are pushing on this, but things evolve more slowly, I think, than many sometimes imagine at the beginning. And so I think that this is the work of all of us to really see women not in the periphery, but at the center of a discussion about national security.
Alyssa, can I add for just a moment that one of the differences I think with this unfolding story on Afghanistan is the fact that so many Americans have direct Afghanistan experience, whether it's been the soldiers and all of the extraordinary stories you're hearing about the Afghans who stood with them in the most difficult circumstances, or the NGOs, the women's rights community, for the better part of 2 decades now, working in every way imaginable, closely with Afghans who have come to the United States, who have worked with us, who have studied with us. There is a bond that I think now is playing out and is going to really be heard increasingly from all of these communities of people in this country who want to see us do the right thing and want to continue to be engaged in some very concrete way to ensure that this investment that's been made mostly by Afghans, but with all of their partners, needs to continue. And it extends to the broader international community, because we weren't in Afghanistan alone. And so many of our friends in Europe and Australia and so many places around the world are as engaged at this moment as they've been throughout the last 2 decades. So I think there is a force that can be tapped, will be tapped, and I think will be self-instigating in some ways to really impact the situation.
Thank you. That's a great point. And there has been a kind of amazing grassroots effort, and I know you all are involved in as well, but across the country to try to help people out. I'm going to go ahead and, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, just to say, look, I have the privilege of attending book clubs all around the country. And, these ladies in Tulsa or ladies in Dallas or women in mid-Missouri or, folks I talk to a lot, and they'll always ask me what's going on with women, and I think that it is about people engaging, because I think that the reality is to exercise power, you have to recognize it, right? And people have the power to make a difference, especially in this moment where we see so much of what had been rigid structures being rethought and reworked and reevaluated. This is a moment when voices from all quarters matter very deeply.
Thanks, Gayle. We've got some questions that have come in on the Q&A, and I'm just going to take a few of them. First, we have one. This is from Nina Lahoud for Ambassador Verveer. From your decades of committed efforts to support conflict-affected women, including in Afghanistan, I would be interested in your view on what might have been done differently during the withdrawal of U.S. and allied forces to better support women and girls.
Are you taking one at a time?
Yeah, we'll do one at a time. Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's always good to hear from Nina, and she herself has been very active on these issues for a long time. I think whatever views people hold about whether it was time to quote unquote leave Afghanistan or stay in some form, there is large recognition that the way we left was not the way we should have left. And I think the preparation that many of us were making, seeing what was happening from the fact that there was no action on the part of the so-called talks in Doha, where months and months were spent. I think I feel now like it was a decoy operation, that while people were thinking there was constructive action going on in Doha, the Taliban were actually strengthening their posture throughout the country. But we needed to be more aware of what was happening in terms of the so-called agreement between the Taliban and the United States, the fact that it wasn't conditioned, the fact that none of the commitments that the Taliban made under that agreement were kept. It should have been a sign for us to rejigger, if nothing else. And what we did was we continued on the path. And that path was a clue, I think, to many of us that we had to prepare for the worst. And had it been done otherwise, I think we might have been certainly better prepared. Whether or not we anticipated Kabul would fall as quickly as it did, the signs were all there that this was going in the wrong direction. And I think we did let down, and many of the Afghans have told us in their emotional and committed state that they feel abandoned. They feel that so much of what they did with us and we did with them was just left as unimportant. And now we find ourselves in these circumstances. So there's going to be plenty of opportunity to look at what should have happened and didn't happen, to do the postmortems. But I think certainly there should have been better preparation so that we wouldn't have had the kind of execution of these final weeks the way it took place.
Thank you. It's very sobering, isn't it? We've got a question that actually builds directly on that. This is from Christy Rogers, who's a member of the board of the Women's Foreign Policy Group. Christy says, this will and must be a long game, but there are still immediate concerns with women and girls in particular, as US citizens trying to evacuate Afghanistan, and the US government, particularly the State Department, has explicitly said they will not assist charter planes filled with these US citizens, women and girls. What can we do to encourage the US government not to abandon them? Who would like to take that?
Well, I would simply say, as I did in my opening remarks, that I believe we have an ongoing obligation when it comes to the evacuation. The president himself has said that all Americans who need to leave and our Afghan allies will get out. What we don't know is how that's going to happen. So I think as Americans, one of the things we should be doing is really putting forward to the administration and to other officials that this remains a high priority, must be a high priority. Work with the Congress and others to ensure that it continues to be a priority. Otherwise, it will vanish from the front pages, and the reality will be that the people we should have helped, we didn't help.
I've got another question. This is a more political situation question. This is from Hale Vaziri. Given that the Taliban has indicated their willingness to establish an inclusive government, in quotes, how can the P5 ensure that their statements in this regard go beyond public relations and become closer to reality? And what do you think such an inclusive government would look like? Who would it include? I think, Rina, this question is tailor-made for you.
Yeah, that's the big question, right? How do we get them to move beyond rhetoric? I mean, I think some of the mechanisms that I've already mentioned would be really important. There are ongoing discussions in Doha, but for the last couple of weeks, they've had nothing to do with anything except evacuations. So there is a forum, there is a space. And I think that's where you need to also, as I noted, you need to bring in the region, the broader regional actors. Qatar is playing a very important role right now with and has been for quite a while with the Taliban. The UAE, Saudi Arabia has a role to play, as well as, and then the obvious actors of Pakistan, in addition to China and Russia, which are part of the P5. And they need to come together. And I think more than anything, the region also has to be convinced that this is to their interest, that the only way that the Taliban will be able to promise any level of stability is if it becomes a more inclusive government. And what I'm hoping is that it's not just an inclusion in terms of bringing in, throwing some crumbs to former members of the Islamic Republic, bringing Dr. Abdullah, bringing President Karzai. We need, certainly that's better than what we have right now, but we need something where they become more ideologically inclusive. Right now, the Taliban itself is quite fragmented. The people that we've been talking to in Doha are the ones that have been making the case for the rehabilitated Taliban, and maybe some of them are, but there's also really radical elements. And what has to happen is to bring in those forces so I've talked about the political forces, I'm going to get to the others as well, that will engender a more, or enable this Taliban to become sort of the more moderate Taliban. And then of course, having women and civil society as key is going to be the key element in terms of engendering a meaningful ideological broadening of the group. Throughout history in Afghanistan, and quite frankly, in many other countries, where you have women's inclusion, the door opens up, they open the door up for greater inclusivity, for greater moderation. And so I would say that in terms of, there's political actors, but there's also stakeholders that need to be brought in. And the way to do it is the U.S., Europe, or more broadly, if we talk about structures, the P5 and the region coming together and adopting a common position and the negotiation with the Taliban.
Thank you.
Can I just add
Yep.
that I think it's going to be important to watch China and Russia. They are there in Taliban-controlled Afghanistan now. Their embassies are open. There was a U.S. back statement that was issued by almost 100 countries, 100 governments, asking that national citizens and Afghans at risk be allowed to leave. Neither China nor Russia signed that statement. President Macron has called for a safe zone where some of these people who desperately need to be evacuated can be evacuated. You know, that's going to take cooperation, for whether it's about that or any number of other things when we look to the UN and what may or may not happen in the Security Council. So I think those are going to be strong political challenges as well.
And
We've
the
got-
freedom of mobility as a test, freedom of mobility as a test, I think is rapidly approaching. And the international community must truly decide if it is capable of coalescing around a view, coalescing around a set of points, and then pursuing them. Because let's talk about what has already happened. $9 billion worth of central bank assets frozen. IMF facility is not accessible. World Bank, which had $5 billion, is not allowing this. I interviewed people who lived under the Taliban last time who sold baby dolls and shoelaces and doors to get their families through. This is a group of people who understands that it might have technicals, but it doesn't have technocrats. And they understand that they need that level of expertise. The international community, I'll go back to the point that Ambassador Verveer and Rina were both making, there is leverage if the international community can exercise it.
Thanks, Gayle. We've got several more questions, but probably just time for one or two more, depending. Here's a question from Seema Jalan. This question is, what is the outlook for sexual and reproductive health and rights? Will essential services continue? What is the role of the UN in supporting women, human rights defenders, and organizing? Who would like to take that one?
Well, you know, Afghanistan has for years been one of the worst countries in terms of maternal and child health. And it's been over the years that the health has improved, whether it's been massive numbers of midwives who've come into the fore or other kinds of health advancements that were made. They're all in jeopardy now. With this humanitarian catastrophe that has befallen and will unfold in worse ways, I think one of the key challenges is going to be healthcare and women's health in particular. So it's a critical issue. You know, it's been interesting and emotionally draining as the women have been evacuated. So many stories have come in about pregnant women or women who were on the bus so close to a checkpoint, ready to get across, and the terror of what they were living with, you know, brought on the kinds of pains that they thought needed to send them to the hospital because of an imminent delivery. Just, you know, when you think of the disparate impact on women of these kinds of conditions, it has got to be something that we better understand. And when it comes to the humanitarian parole and the lack of benefits and services, one of the critical needs is going to be health. And again, how are we going to address that? So it's got to be a top priority.
And health was a sector where NGOs operated throughout last time. There was a young woman I interviewed who ran WASH sanitation, did sanitation instruction throughout the last time. So there is an understanding of the urgency of this. And the question is how to engage so that women stay alive and that their rights can be fought for by themselves and at least acknowledged by those who are leading them.
I'm going to go with one last question here. This gets us back to some of the security considerations. This is from Maggie Sparling. How does the threat from ISKP, ISIS Khorasan province, impact or complicate the outcome for women in Afghanistan? Who would like to take that one?
I just want to note that we're focusing on ISIS Khorasan, but it's broader than that. It is not just one terrorist group. And right now, there's, I think ISIS really strikes the US imagination, but I really want to emphasize that we should be looking more broadly about a broad range of security threats. And women, sometimes women's rights are treated like they're on an island onto themselves. They're part of to address women's situation, you absolutely have to address the broader security, the broader humanitarian, the broader human rights situation. So it's the fact that, you know, with the fall of the Republic, just every element of security that was there for women has been stripped. You know, women kept on saying over and over again to me that to protect our rights, the Islamic Republic has to hold. The Afghan National Security Forces have to hold. And those elements are all gone. And so they are at their most vulnerable at this point and require our assistance. And as Melanne said, we need monitoring. The only modicum of support that we can at least provide for them inside the country is pushing the UN Human Rights Council to enable a monitoring mechanism for human rights.
You know, I would just say very, very quickly that one of the things that all these horrific terrorist groups have in common is targeting women, whether it's ISIS, Boko Haram, Taliban, you name it. And there's something threatening about a girl with a book or a woman who has her own occupation. And that's where the put down comes first. That's where the terror gets most manifested initially.
We actually have one question that's almost a comment, but it's an opportunity if there are any resources that you know of. Alice Thomas asks, is anyone tracking instances of human rights abuses against Afghan women that are taking place? How about the number of Afghan women who have been evacuated versus men? Are there any good sources for tracking?
I don't know if it's systematic. I know there's some tracking happening, particularly in terms of evacuees. And what's been observed is that when the US notes that the priorities are the citizens and allies, well, the majority of translators, like I think over 80% of them are men. And so women were just by the nature of that definition, women were left out. And what we've observed is that the most vulnerable people have fallen through the cracks by that level of prioritization. And it's been up to philanthropies and individuals that have come together to help those most vulnerable, the women and human rights defenders. That has been such a woefully woeful shortcoming, another one of sort of the way that both the US and the broader international community have adopted the stance that they've adopted vis-a-vis evacuation.
So we are nearly out of time. Let me take this opportunity to thank all of you for taking the time to talk with us today about this crisis, about women in crisis in Afghanistan. This has been a really, really good conversation, and we're going to put this online, so it'll be available afterwards. But thank you again. Thanks for taking the time here. Let me turn things over to Shaz.
Thank you very much. On behalf of Women's Foreign Policy Group, I thank all our panelists for joining us today. If you haven't already read Gayle's books, I hope you'll add them to your fall reading list. As part of our initiative to support Afghan women and girls, Women's Foreign Policy Group has created a resource page that includes several partner organization projects. Please visit wfpg.org to get involved. And thank you to our incredible audience for joining us and submitting excellent questions. A recording of this session will be available to all attendees and will also be uploaded to WFPG's YouTube channel. We hope that you'll stay connected. Join us as a member if you aren't already, and consider signing up to be a virtual mentor, supporting our mission to prepare the next generation of women and mid-career professionals for leadership. I look forward to seeing you all again soon. Bye now.
Thank you.
Thank you.